The Aztecs, a unique Aboriginal civilization with a vast 60,000 population who situated themselves in Central America from 1325 till 1521 AD. This society established their kingdom in the valley near Lake Texcoco and built their first temples in Tenochtitlan, which is now known as modern-day Mexico. They spoke a native language called Nahuatl and was led by a man named Montezuma, who believed he was the man their mighty gods had sent to rule the empire. The group was a warrior-based culture with many traditions, which were thought as strange and sometimes even controversial. Thus, when European contact was placed upon these people, conflict, misunderstandings, and violence would unveil. The Aztecs had many traditions that were performed for generations. The society had outstanding craftsmen and sculptors that produced many interesting monuments that are still seen today. As well, the society took a unique approach on architecture that allowed them to stand out among other empires. With their remarkable architectural and artistic accomplishments, the society was seen as a threat compared to the mediocre groups around them. In addition, the distinctive group had extremely religious and spiritual beliefs, which set them aside from most empires. The Aztecs believed that their gods were placed within a celestial object. For example, the Aztecs' main god, Huitzilopochtli, was a mighty god of the sun. However, the people didn't only worship one god. They had numerous gods and religious figures who were just as important, as opposed to Christianity, which only praised one. To please their gods, the people would hold celebrations with cultural dancing and drumming, while often bearing gifts to decorate the city in honor of their gods. Some gifts were as simple as foods, feathers, arrows, and other luxuries. Others were as complex as human sacrifice. It was thought that human sacrifice was the greatest honor that mortals could provide for their gods. Thus, this ritual was performed since the beginning of the Aztec civilization. With the land they inhabited, the Aztec weaponry was not as advanced or as powerful as the Europeans. Their weapons consisted of swords, spears, and arrows made out of obsidian or flint, and whips that were composed of animal hide. Due to the fact the empire was never exposed to new, advanced technologies the Europeans had possessed, they stuck to their traditional resources and practiced and performed their own traditions and religion. However, everything was about to change.
At the turn of the 15th century, a fleet of 11 Spanish galleons led by Cortez, a Spanish explorer, embarked towards Mexico where they heard of a wealthy civilization. They traveled for weeks on end, and finally anchored in Tenochtitlan, the Aztec city, on November 8, 1590, where they were greeted warmly by their leader Montezuma. The Aztecs had heard of Cortez's earlier conquests and believed he was the Aztec god Quetzalcoatl. When Cortez entered the Aztec city, he was immersed in fear, for he saw how large the Aztec civilization really was, and feared that they would be able to overpower his fleet of 500 men. Thinking this, Cortez captured Montezuma and retreated out of the city. The Aztecs were in disarray. They had no leader and were unsure of what to do. This led to chaos in their community. Back at the Spanish camp, Cortez had made Montezuma swear allegiance to the King of Spain. Cortez could now feel at ease because the Aztecs were under his control. There was peace between the Aztecs and the Spanish for some time. Their leader Montezuma had been returned after being traded for gold, and there had been no outbreaks between the two groups for 6 months. But this soon changed. During one of Cortez's absences, one of his officers massacred 200 Aztec nobles who had gathered for a religious ceremony. This caused outrage in the Aztec society, and they rebelled and fought back for their rights and freedom from the Spanish. Montezuma was killed during the outbreak. After years of ongoing battle, the Aztecs surrendered in 1521. Cortez then took over all the remaining Aztecs who had survived the war, and diseases passed on to them from the Spanish. The Spanish built a colony on the ruins of Tenochtitlan, called New Mexico, and erased as much as they could of the Aztec kingdom. The remaining Aztec that lived were sold in the slave trade to willing buyers.
The overall impact of the Aztecs' identity was more negative. Therefore, our group agrees with Barlow that globalization harms the world's cultures. When the Spanish came in contact with the Aztec, they felt that they had the right to conquer the land the Aztecs owned, and they had the power to rule over them as well. As a result of Spain conquering Central America, many Aztec were killed because of the war, but also disease like smallpox, which spread quickly throughout their cities because no one had resistance to the disease. After the Spanish took control of the lands and the people, they introduced a Council of Indies in 1524 and Audiencia in 1527. The Council of Indies acted as a government, and the Audiencia defined the territory of New Mexico. These two councils effectively took away the right of the Aztecs and surrounding groups to rule over themselves. In 1546, Spanish authorities discovered silver in the Zacatecas region and established mining settlements in Chichimeca territory, which altered the terrain and the Chichimeca traditional way of life. The people of central Mexico were outraged to find out that the Spanish soldiers supplemented their income by raiding villages and selling the indigenous people into slavery. The Aztecs were also forced to give up their traditional beliefs and rituals for Spanish ones. For example, the Aztec were forced to believe in Christianity, and many Aztec children were forced to learn and read the Bible at school. All in all, the Aztecs were negatively affected by the idea of globalization. Their identity was stripped from them when the Spanish conquistadors invaded their territory and forced them to learn European traditions. They were taken advantage of and used as slaves while treated like animals. The civilization was wiped out and assimilated.